I'm Dave Sutherland. I'm a park ranger naturalist, retired from the City of Boulder's Open Space and Mountain Parks program. For over 20 years, I managed the native plant garden up at the Chautauqua Ranger Cottage. And then we bought this house in 1997, and I turned the landscape all around the house into a Colorado native xeriscape. So almost all of the plants in most of the yard are native to Colorado, and most of them are actually native to Boulder County. Years ago, before I moved to Colorado, I had a job in the Galapagos Islands. And one of the real threats to the Galapagos Island ecosystem is that people who live there are bringing all kinds of non-native organisms out from the mainland that would then get out of cultivation, they'd get out of people's yards and start growing into the national park. And by the time I was there in the early 90s, the problem with non-native plants was severe. So I had this crazy, wacky idea. Could you do a landscape using just Galapagos native plants? And so that you wouldn't need to import anything, could you make an attractive landscape just using the local plants? And so I tried it. For the 3 years we lived in Galapagos, I turned the landscape around our little rental house into a native plant landscape. And it worked. I had some really very pretty plants, and I had a gorgeous little landscape, and it was all just plants that were native to the Galapagos Islands. After we moved to Colorado, I discovered that there were people here who already had that idea. They were already doing native plant gardens. I wasn't the only one who'd had that idea, and so I got on working with the native plant garden at the Ranger Cottage and eventually took that one over. My garden it's a xeriscape. It really doesn't get any extra supplemental water except when plants are small. Typically when somebody says the word xeriscape, the image that kind of comes to mind is like a yard made out of raked gravel with a token cactus in it. And in fact, my xeriscape is lush and gorgeous and beautiful, and it blooms with tons of flowers. Native plants attract native insects, and native insects feed native birds and native bats. And I have seen such a change of wildlife in my yard since I started growing the native plants. A lot of the native pollinator insects, particularly native bees, are in decline. And so by growing native plants that have these tight evolutionary relationships with native insects, I'm providing them a place to live, providing them with a habitat. And the more people around here who have gardens like mine, the more we start to create kind of a patchwork quilt of habitats. It's really easy for these vanishing native insects to have a habitat where they can link around, they can find mates. We can create these kind of native insect corridors that span multiple yards. And so we can really serve the ecosystem that way too. Over the years, I've found that there's some plants I just can't seem to grow, and there's some plants that seem to grow too well. So I do have to put a lot of time and investment into my garden trying to make sure that, say, for example, all of the smooth asters don't just take over, because they will. And since I want to have a lot of diversity in my garden, I want to have as many different species as I can. I've got about 90 different Colorado native species in my garden. The challenge is that here in Colorado, here in the arid West, we are still kind of slaves to a moisture climate, East Coast aesthetic of deciduous forests and green grassy lawns, and it's not appropriate here. And so the challenge is, how in Colorado do we change our aesthetic so that it's a Colorado aesthetic that is much more in harmony with what the environment here can actually grow and what the environment here can actually produce and protect and sustain. It's catching on, but we've still got a long way to go selling that idea of a more sustainable, more appropriate Colorado aesthetic. I do a couple of different slideshows about native plant gardens, and I do tours of my garden around the home to show people what a 28-year-old Colorado native xeriscape looks like. When I started 28 years ago, there were no resources. Now there are just oodles and piles of resources online about Colorado native plants. And interestingly, it's not just a Colorado thing. I mean, there are people in Tennessee growing Tennessee native gardens. It's the same concept, but a whole different palette of plant. There are a lot of classes going on now by groups like Wild Ones. Colorado Native Plant Society is another great resource. Harlequin's Garden is a resource. And even the city of Boulder. All of these groups are now offering volunteer opportunities where you can learn how to do it. You can learn to collect seed and clean seed. You can go to a workshop where you learn how to sow your own native plants so that you can grow out your own little seedlings for things that you can't find in a nursery. Start thinking about host plants and start thinking about everything you can do to see your garden not just as providing for pollinators, but providing for this whole broader ecosystem all the way up to things like bats and birds.